So today's webinar is how to avoid common pitfalls when writing evaluation plans for ATE proposals. As a reminder, everyone is in listen-only mode today, meaning your microphones and cameras have been disabled. Please enter any questions in the chat box and we will answer them throughout the webinar. This webinar is brought to you by Evaluate, the evaluation hub for Advanced Technological Education program. Evaluate advances evaluation in the ATE community by offering trainings, cultivating a network, researching emerging topics, and collecting data about the ATE program. Be sure to check out the Evaluate website to learn more. The slides from this webinar are posted on Evaluate's website, along with several other resources. You will be navigated to the resource once you close the webinar browser. We will email the recording as soon as it's available. I'm Emma Lieberg, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. Lissa Wilson-Betcho will be the presenter for today's webinar. We both work with Evaluate, which is located at the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University. We'd like to also recognize our colleagues who have worked behind the scenes to help bring us this webinar today. First, a big thank you to Anna Consol, who is providing technical support during today's live event. And thank you to Lori Wingate, Kelly Robertson, and Valerie Marshall for their input on the creation of today's webinar content. We also want to recognize the input from our community reviewers, Ann Johnson with the Jefferson Community and Technical College, and Laura Waldman with Thomas P. Miller and Associates. Finally, a thank you to Carolyn Williams-Norin for copy editing our slides and additional materials. This webinar is designed for individuals funded by the National Science Foundation's Advanced Technological Education Program, or ATE for short. The program is focused on improving technician education, mainly through two-year colleges. It funds projects in high-tech areas like advanced manufacturing, engineering technology, IT, nanotechnology, and so on. You can learn more about the ATE program by clicking on using the link on the screen. This is a good time to point out that the views expressed in this webinar are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. And now I will turn things over to Lissa.
And hello, everyone. As Emma said, my name is Lissa, and I'm happy to be here today with you to talk about evaluation plans for ATE proposals. So in today's webinar, we're going to start things off with a brief overview of what evaluation is and why you need to include it in your proposal. Then we're going to focus the majority of today's webinar on pitfalls and how to avoid them. So we hope this webinar gives you some heads up on things to look out for when writing your own proposal. We also want to provide you with further resources you can use to create high-quality evaluation plans for your proposal. So to kick things off, let's start out with a poll to see who we have on the webinar with us today. Emma, go ahead and activate our first poll. So it should show up on the right-hand side of your screen. If your system hasn't automatically switched over to the poll, you can navigate to the poll using the poll tab on the right-hand corner of your screen. So this poll asks, which best describes your role? Are you a principal investigator or a co-PI? Are you a project team member, a grants professional, evaluator, or something else? If you're something else, go ahead and add your role in the chat window. So I see we've had a number of people answering so far. We have a lot of evaluators on with us today. Almost about 60% of those who have responded so far are evaluators. We have a lot of grants professionals as well, almost about 20%, and then followed by principal investigators or co-PIs and project team members. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining today. We hope that this webinar has useful content for all of you. So don't forget to navigate back to the chat window after you're done with the poll to continue chatting with other participants. So first of all, what is evaluation and why do we need to include it in your ATE proposal? Well, evaluation is the systematic determination of a project's quality and effectiveness. An evaluation can help document what the project did and the project's contributions to improving technician education and the workforce. It can also be a really helpful tool for project decision-making and planning, helping you to know what aspects of the project are working well and for whom. So to boil down the evaluation process to its essence, Evaluation first starts by asking important questions about a project's processes and outcomes. Then the evaluator and project team gathers evidence that will help answer those questions. The evaluation team then interprets that data, making meaningful statements that answer the evaluation questions. And finally, evaluation results are shared with stakeholders and used for the purposes of accountability, project improvement, and planning. So this is evaluation in a nutshell, asking important questions and gathering data to answer them. Evaluation can serve as a valuable role for helping projects learn about the processes and outcomes of their projects. Evaluation is also valuable to NSF. So Celeste Carter, the ATE Program Director, emphasizes, if you don't evaluate and assess your activities and outcomes, you can't know if the project was successful. She goes on to say that evaluation also provides the project team with data to convince others of the success of the project, as well as contributing to the body of knowledge in that particular area of STEM. Note that Dr. Carter acknowledges the importance of evaluation findings for both the internal project team to acknowledge the extent of the project's success, but also to share with external stakeholders. If you're interested in learning more about the purposes and processes of evaluation, we have a really great series of short videos on evaluation basics for non-evaluators you can access on our webpage. So I want to pause here to do another poll. So Emma, can you bring up that second poll? So again, you should be navigated to the polls tab, and if not, you can go over there and click on it. So this webinar is specifically about evaluation plans for ATE proposals. So this poll asks, how are you involved in the ATE program or NSF? Is this maybe your first time ever submitting a proposal to ATE? Maybe you're submitting another proposal to ATE, or you're already funded, or maybe you're involved with a different NSF program. And also, maybe you might not be involved with ATE or NSF at all. So I see that we actually have a number of people, almost 50% of the people who have answered so far aren't actually involved with ATE or NSF. And I want to point out that you're very welcome and we're happy to have you, and that this webinar will still provide helpful guidance to writing evaluation plans for non-ATE and non-NSF proposals as well. I do see that we have a number of people that are already funded by ATE, so welcome back. And then we have almost 10% of people who this is really their first time submitting a proposal to ATE. Great, wonderful. So don't forget to navigate back to the chat menu. So this webinar will focus on major pitfalls of evaluation plans and proposals, the things that prior submitters have really slipped up on. So unlike prior webinars on a similar topic, we will not be covering the general content of what you should include in a proposal. If you want to know more about what that content is and what you should include, take a look at our evaluation plan checklist for ATE proposals. This checklist provides a comprehensive overview of the elements that should be included in your evaluation plan. Things like your evaluator, evaluation questions, evaluation data and methods, communication and use of your results, and finally a timeline. So as a complement to that checklist, we also have a short video series based on our webinar from last year about the essential elements of an evaluation plan for proposals. These short videos really expand and explain the content of an evaluation plan. So we hope you check those out. So since we have done a few webinars already about this topic, we wanted to do something a little bit different this year. So we wanted to share with you examples of what to do and what not to do, inspired by real-world evaluation plans submitted to the NSF ATE program. We wanted to go beyond the content shared in our prior webinars to really engage you in actively analyzing these examples and thinking critically around how to present the needed information in the most succinct and clear manner. So the most important part of an evaluation section of a proposal is to clearly communicate the evaluation steps we discussed earlier. So what questions will be asked? How will evidence be gathered and analyzed? And how will it be reported and used? This webinar focuses on the bigger picture, how these pieces can come together to form a strong, cohesive story about the value of evaluation. So throughout the webinar, I'm going to ask you to think critically about the examples that you see. Put on your NSF reviewer hat. Imagine yourself as a reviewer. Closely examine the examples. What further questions would you have? What is unclear or confusing? And then together, we'll talk about how the pitfalls that we see can be improved. So please share your thoughts and suggestions in the chat window to the right side of your screen. We will also have 2 question breaks, so feel free to enter any questions that you might have along the way in the chat window. And Emma will keep track of them along the way, and then we'll discuss during the break. All right, so let's take a look at the common pitfalls in evaluation plans for proposals. So our first pitfall is choosing an evaluator who is internal to the project. So the ATE solicitation does require that projects include an evaluator who is external to the project. So here's our first excerpt from a proposal. So I'll give you a second to take a look at it. It states that the project director will be conducting the evaluation project. This evaluation plan would receive a rather low rating in the NSF review because the identified evaluator is not external to the grant. This plan could be greatly improved by choosing an evaluator who's not associated with the project team. Here you can see we have replaced the project director with Dr. Washington and identified them as an external evaluator. So this seems like a simple switch on paper, but obviously there's more work behind the proposal that's needed to identify and select the right evaluator. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. So to avoid this first pitfall, ensure that the evaluator has no connection or political influence over the project or project team members. One way to check this is to make sure that the identified evaluator doesn't have another line item on the budget aside from the evaluation work. So to learn more about who can be considered external to the project, check out the second video in this series, Evaluation: The Secret Sauce in Your ATE Proposal. So the second pitfall is when an evaluation plan does not provide justification for their choice of evaluators. So let's take a look at an excerpt that makes this mistake. So here's where I'm going to ask you all to think like an NSF reviewer. So if you were a reviewer for ATE, NSF, or other types of proposals, and you saw this as the explanation for the choice in evaluator, how would you rate it? Do you think this explanation is enough information to convince you of the evaluator credentials? What other details would you want to know? Make sure you can make your comments in the chat box to the right. So what do you think? If you saw this as an explanation on a proposal, do you think that this is enough information? So Amanda points out that coordinating evaluations and conducting them are not the same thing. Good point, Amanda. Philip says that there's really insufficient information. Belinda says the credentials are really missing, right? Casey kind of guessed, like, do you think it should be more detailed? Yeah. Chris says there's not enough information to establish expertise. So that's really where we're going, in the sense of, if you just said that Dr. Parks has conducted evaluations before, you know, the reviewer might have lots of questions, like what kind of evaluations for what kinds of NSF grants? You know, really providing a justification and a backing for those expertise and those prior experiences. So like we said, this example only vaguely references that their chosen evaluator has prior experience with similar grants. However, it really leaves out more specific details. And without more information, it's really difficult for the reviewers to determine if the evaluator is qualified to evaluate the proposed project. So let's take a look at an improvement. So here you can see off the bat, this is a little bit longer than the prior example. So it specifically points out that the type of training and evaluation, right? So in this case, we're saying that Dr. Parks has a PhD in evaluation, but a PhD alone doesn't make someone a qualified evaluator. So again, this example goes on and provides further detail on the prior experience, the specific types of grants that were evaluated. So now we're saying that they have evaluated prior ATE grants. And it also refers to more details in an attached bio sketch. So a bio sketch can be a really great way to include more details about your evaluator. However, it's not required that reviewers look at those supplemental documents. So you want to make sure that you include at least enough information in the project description, and then you can refer to more information in the end. I see that Stephen is pointing out that evaluation PhDs are not necessary to evaluate ATE projects or other projects. I completely agree, and I do want to point that out. And so this idea of, what is the qualification, what is their training in evaluation, and it doesn't have to be a PhD. So the other thing that this example does really well is the fact that it matches the methodological expertise of the evaluator to the proposed evaluation plan. So there would have been a mismatch if Dr. Parks had expertise in, say, qualitative interviews, but the primary data collection for the proposed evaluation was survey methods. But you can see here that both the expertise and the proposed methods match. So they're both survey methodologies. So to avoid this pitfall, make sure to address the chosen evaluators' qualifications, really showcase their prior experience, and match their qualifications to the specific evaluation plan. So if you want to learn more about what evaluator qualifications PI should be looking for, or what you should highlight, take a look at our resource on finding and selecting an evaluator for ATE proposals. So our third pitfall is having an overly general, like a cut and paste evaluation plan. So let's take a look at an example of that. So take a minute to read this example. So like before, how would you rate this if you were a reviewer? What questions do you still have after reading through it? Would you feel satisfied if this was a full explanation of the evaluation plan? So I see that Michael pointed out, like, this is pretty generic. And Aaron's asking, what are the specifics? Yeah, Donna points out, too general about the activities, like what are the deliverables? Casey says there isn't anything specific. So when we say like that an evaluation plan is too general or cut and paste, we're talking about language like this, right? Where we're saying the evaluator will compile and present an assessment of project activities and progress towards project objectives, right? So this is really like high in the sky, really high level overview of what's going on, but it's not telling us the details. It's not really telling us what's going on. So many of you commented on the lack of explanation of how the evaluation will actually be conducted. So there's a lot of filler language in this that generally explains the evaluation from high level, but at no point are they specific about what actually is going to happen. And so this includes a lack of what are the evaluation questions, or what are the evaluation criteria that will be measured. The evaluation plan section of your proposal is not about explaining what evaluation is in the abstract, but you want to explain this particular evaluation. If your description can be said of all evaluations, then it's really not specific enough. So let's take a look at an improved example. So I'll give you a minute to read this. So even in this paragraph, which is not very long, and it's most likely an introduction paragraph, right? And it still is fairly general, but you can really see that the proposed evaluation plan is key to 6 overarching evaluation questions. And it says that those are more fully explained in Table 2. The description notes that the table details the specific indicators and data sources and methods. And it also acknowledges that the evaluation activities are in direct response to project activities and outcomes. So specifically, they have aligned these through the use of a logic model. Mapping evaluation questions to a project logic model can be a really great way to ensure that evaluation addresses the process as well as outcomes. And so from this example, reviewers can tell that the evaluation was planned intentionally and strategically, and that it wasn't just an afterthought. So here you have the detailing more information in the figures and tables. And then the fact that the evaluation details really are a direct response to the project activities and outcomes. So to avoid this pitfall of having an overly general evaluation plan, make sure to be specific to the project that's being proposed. expand on how the evaluation activities match with the project activities and outcomes, and avoid this vague filler language. Elizabeth Tellis, a program officer at NSF, recently updated her resources on 10 helpful hints and 10 fatal flaws for ATE proposals. Dr. Tellis warns of cut and paste evaluation plans, quite literally plans that have not been changed between proposals, noting that reviewers will notice that the evaluation section of multiple proposals have almost identically written evaluation plans in their proposal. She has other really great tips and suggestions for creating a great evaluation plan, so I hope you check out her updated resource. So we're going to go ahead and pause here for our first question break, and I'm going to hand it over to Emma to see what questions we have.
Thanks, Lisa. So yeah, we did get some great questions in that first break. So first, I'm going to kick it off here with Taylor. So this was a specific question that was asked when you were covering the credentials for the evaluator. Do we need to provide those credentials in the evaluation plan or in the biographical sketch, or both?
That's a great question, Taylor. So the biographical sketch would be added as a supplemental document, and reviewers are not required to look at those documents when rating proposals. So I think we are doing that balancing act, right, of making sure that we're providing a sentence or two in the actual project description, in the evaluation section about the credentials of the evaluator, but also referring to the fact that there's more details in a bio sketch attached.
All right, our next question is from Emily. So that one is, if you are unable to choose your evaluator before the grant is submitted, would you want to include some selection criteria in the proposal? And this one was answered in the chat box by another attendee, but Lisa, if you want to go ahead and answer it for the full group, I'll hand that over to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Emily. And thank you. I'm not sure who answered it. I haven't quite been able to stay up with the chat box, but I'm glad someone chimed in as well. We know a lot of colleges are actually requiring that projects do not name an evaluator up front, but go through a bidding process after the grant is awarded. And so that is certainly something that is familiar to NSF and familiar to reviewers. So if you're unable to name an actual evaluator in your proposal, make sure you just explain that. Say that your college or your institution has processes in place that do limit that, and then talk about how you will go about choosing an evaluator after you're funded, and exactly like you said, what some of your selection criteria will be when identifying that evaluator.
So our next question is from Stephen, and they asked, evaluation is a generalist field. Does ATE insist on specifically having experience in evaluating ATE grants or NSF grants?
Yeah, so I completely agree, being a very generalist myself and a methodologist. So there are no specific requirements that come from the National Science Foundation about an evaluator for an ATE project having specific experience in ATE or other STEM education fields. However, depending on the project that you are working with, depending on the PI, it might be something that they're looking for. And unfortunately, there's no black and white answer to this, but depending on the reviewers, it might be something that is in the back of their mind in terms of, will this evaluator have the right knowledge to evaluate this program? So I think as long as the plan is set out in a very clear way that justifies why they are measuring the criteria that they're measuring, which instruments they're using, and why they chose those instruments, then you're making a good argument.
And our final question for this section came in from Michael. How long, pages, word count, should the evaluation section be? Does the length include the logic model?
Great question, Michael. So normally the project description, the project description for ATE projects is limited to 15 pages. We generally suggest that around 2 of those pages be devoted to the evaluation plan. It depends, whether that includes the logic model, depends on how you want to integrate it. Some projects have written great proposals that have the logic model in the evaluation section and specifically tie it to the evaluation and use it that way. Other great proposals have it in other places in the project description, but then refer to it in the evaluation section. So again, I've seen it be done wonderfully both ways. It's just about being intentional and being really clear in how you are connecting the evaluation activities to the project activities.
Perfect. So Alyssa, I'm going to let you go ahead for the next section here and leave it over to you.
Wonderful. And we do have another question break after the next 3 pitfalls. So I'm sure if there are things we didn't get to or things that are still on your mind, we can certainly talk about them then. All right. So on to pitfall number 4, which is having an unclear connection between the project activities, the evaluation methods, and measures. So while this one is related to our last pitfall about being overly general and cut and paste, avoiding this pitfall takes some additional thought. So let's take a look at our first example. So if you are a reviewer and you saw this written in an evaluation plan, what would your thoughts be? How would you rate this description? So I know many of you are still reading. This one could be a bit tough because the description does refer to surveys and interviews, so it has a little bit more detail than some of the ones we saw in the last example. I see some people pointing out, I like that Aaron just said, meh. Jeremy said he'd rate it pretty low. Kimberly said low. Jason's pointing out that it's still pretty vague. Yeah, Jackie, which methods are being used for which outcomes and which data? Casey points out that it just doesn't seem interconnected. So sometimes when we are first writing an evaluation plan, we think that we put everything down on paper, right? But your reviewers can't read between the lines. You need to be really explicit and intentional about matching these things with each other. Yeah, Amanda says it would be better referenced in a table. Yeah, just wait, we love tables here. So yeah, like you're saying, we're still left with questions about the evaluation and how that they will provide meaningful findings. So some of you pointed out the vague nature of this description, and in many ways, it is an improvement from some of the overly general examples that we saw in our last pitfall. But like we said, it assumes that the reader can really infer which outcomes will be measured from the logic model. So the logic model might be included somewhere else in the proposal, but without an explicit connection to that evaluation plan, it remains really unclear what and how the evaluation will be measuring. So again, it does not match the data collection methods with what will be measured and what the questions around the data really are answering. So ensuring that these pieces are tied together to create a clear understanding of what the evaluation will be doing is really important. And remember that the reviewers cannot be expected to read between the lines. So an improvement for this description might look something like this. So this example lists out the different data collection sources and methods. You can see they say they're going to collect student success data to compare success rates, but also changes in enrollment, retention, completion rates. They're going to measure recruitment, retention. So we're getting a lot more specifics on what they're going to measure. But the description, is still in this paragraph format. So it's starting to match the data sources and measures, but there's still some ambiguity around what exactly is meant by some things, right? So what do they really mean by student data and where is this information coming from? So to continue to improve on this, we recommend using an evaluation matrix or a table, like Amanda said before. So it looks something like this. So you can see the column titles that this author has chosen are relevant project activities, evaluation questions, and data collection sources. So each are aligned in a unique row, allowing reviewers to easily match across. So I've seen similar tables with different column titles, but they all serve to clearly define that what data is being collected and how it will be meaningful to the project. So while it may seem that a table like this would take up too much space in your proposal, since it's only limited to that 2 pages out of the 15-page project description like we talked about before, a table like this can be really beneficial in conveying a lot of information all at once in an easily accessible manner. So to read more about creating an evaluation matrix and to jumpstart making your own, take a look at our evaluation matrix template. So to avoid the unclear connections between project activities, evaluation methods, and measures, make sure to match these elements together, potentially in a table that connects all the different pieces. So on to pitfall number 5, only asking about the easy things. So let's take a look at an example that falls into this pit. So this example says that they're going to measure the creation of an advisory board, the production of documentation based on planning activities, along with student satisfaction and experience in the courses. So what do you think? I want to hear your comments. Do you think that this is enough evidence to evaluate whether the program is working? Is it enough to really make the case for the overall impact of the project? What would you say to this if you saw this as a reviewer? So Stephen points out that there really are no outcome measurements listed here. What other comments do you have? Casey says it doesn't actually describe how these things will be done. Becca points out that this is more of a process evaluation. Chris mentions that there are no baselines and targets. And Jackie points out that it really depends on what the project outcomes are. So I'm seeing Lydia and others pick up on this, a little bit of a confusion between outputs and outcomes, right? So the first two things that they want to measure in this example really are what we would call outputs, not outcomes. So they're confirming that the activities proposed by the project are actually happening. So the creation of the advisory board and the documentation are both things that are tangible outputs after the project activities happen. And then the second two measures, the student satisfaction and the overall experience, are really short-term outcomes. So satisfaction is one of the most common measurements in ATE evaluations. And by no means am I saying that satisfaction is not important to look at. However, it's not the only thing you want to look at. You want to ask questions like, what skills did students gain from these courses? Were they prepared to join the workforce? What kind of employment did they receive after completing their program? These questions are certainly hard to answer, and they might require a follow-up with alumni and additional data collection beyond the post-course survey, but they're also really impactful pieces of evidence to determine the value and overall worth of the program. So take a moment to read through this improved example. So in this evaluation plan, they talk about how they're going to track student degree completion rates and course grades, as well as their overall experience, their career goals, and the skills that they've gained. They also intend to conduct a survey with students after they graduate about their job placements and plans for the future. Yeah, so Greg points out this really connects to the program goals of the initial program. So sorry about that. So here we see that this example is really going beyond just those outputs and the short-term outcomes, right? It's going beyond the easy things to ask about, and it's really starting to get at those harder things, those long-term outcomes and a little bit of the impact, right? And it's really trying to compile a collection of evidence that speaks to both the short-term and the long-term outcomes of the project. This evaluation data will really be able to make a stronger argument that the project is or is not achieving its overarching goals and the broader impact on advanced technological fields. So to avoid asking only about the easy things, ensure your evaluation questions and data go beyond outputs and short-term outcomes. It can be helpful to intentionally have evaluation questions that address the project's process as well as its outcomes. Something that might be helpful is the Kirkpatrick model. So the Kirkpatrick model is a framework organized around 4 levels of different impact. So you have reaction, learning, behavior, and results. And so this evaluation model was created specifically for evaluating training initiatives in the business sector. However, it can provide a helpful mental model to consider going beyond those easy things. So for example, if you were to do an evaluation of a program, the reaction might be the new course The reaction to a new course might be measured by student satisfaction. So we talked about satisfaction, right? But how do you go beyond that? So the level of learning could be measured by the skills that students acquire. The behavior level might be measured by whether or not they continue to pursue a STEM career. And then the results level might be whether or not they're employed in a STEM position post-program completion. So you can read more about this evaluation model in the Evaluate blog, Kirkpatrick Model for ATE Evaluation. So our final pitfall for today is when there is no discussion of how the evaluation will be used. So in this first example, it states that all of the materials produced under this project include the logic model, including the logic model, documentation, evaluations, curriculum, and other documentation will be stored on a network server. So while this is a good explanation of storing and archiving, it's not a good explanation for what happens to the evaluation reports after they're completed. So mention of your evaluation does belong in the data management plan of an overall proposal, but it's not acceptable if this is the only mention of the evaluation report after receiving it. It really doesn't address how project staff will take action as a result of the evaluation. So let's take a look at another example that might not be rated too highly either. So this one notes that a report will be prepared and that it will be provided with the inclusion of the project's final report to the National Science Foundation. So while you do need to include your evaluation report in your annual report to NSF, NSF and reviewers want to see that the project staff is actively using evaluation findings to improve their project and to plan for the future. So this example uses evaluation report for compliance purposes only. This explanation is not really sufficient enough to show how the evaluation will really be used and useful to the project. So here is an improved example. So it does acknowledge that the PI will consult regularly with the evaluator, and the evaluator will provide ongoing feedback throughout the project on the quality of the project activities and products. This is not the only way to use evaluation results, but what is important is that the proposal is communicating how evaluation will be integrated into the improvement and the sustainability of the project. And it's not just conducted as an afterthought or for compliance purposes only. So to avoid this last pitfall, acknowledge how project staff will use evaluation findings for project improvement. And if you need some inspiration on how evaluation can be used, take a look at Lori Wingate's blog, 3 Questions to Spur Actions for Your Evaluation Report. So in it, she discusses how to consider crafting recommendations from the evaluation and questions to consider if those recommendations are not so obvious. All right, well, we have reached our final question break for today. So I'm going to hand it over to Emma to answer some questions.
Awesome, Lisa, thank you. Yeah, so we actually had a question that came through during the last section from Stephen. So I'm going to review it and then we'll put up the question for everyone to see. So Stephen says, I'm an independent for-profit consultant and NSF does not allow the cost of preparing a proposal or the evaluation plan for the proposal in the cost of the grant. Some higher education institutions have to go out for bids for evaluators after receiving the grants. What would you recommend as fair to evaluators like myself asked to prepare a semi-detached evaluation plan approach before the proposal is even submitted? So kind of a big question there, but I think we've run into it before. So really asking about how evaluators kind of handle that pre-award side in preparing evaluation plans.
Is an issue of doing business as an evaluator. And it's something that comes up in ATE and NSF, as well as other sectors, right? So I work with other projects in the philanthropic world, nonprofit world, and there's always this kind of tension in the fact that generally, whoever the grant funder is not providing upfront funding for that time to develop the evaluation plan. And we know from evaluation approaches like culturally responsive evaluation that it is important to make sure that you, or even utilization-focused evaluation, it's really important to identify who those key users, those key stakeholders are, and engage them throughout the process of creating that evaluation plan. So unfortunately, there is no perfect answer here. I do know that many evaluators within the ATE world, as well as general independent consultants, kind of just recognize that this comes with the business and that they are willing to work with project staff and PIs to develop an evaluation plan prior to the grant being funded, with the assumptions that if it is funded, that they will be the evaluator. However, like you said, you asked specifically, what do you recommend is fair to evaluators like myself? I think that that question is difficult to answer unless we want to completely rethink the structure of how proposals are done and how evaluators are chosen, which unfortunately is not up to us as evaluators. It is really something structural from the side of the National Science Foundation, other funders, as well as the institutions that receive the grants.
Thank you. And I'm going to pop this one up. I know it's not in order, but I'm going to pop this one up in lead because it kind of goes right along with the topic of what Stephen was asking about. What would you recommend to someone from an institution who not only can't name an evaluator, so no contract allowed before the funding is procured, but who cannot accept good faith work before a contract is settled?
Yeah, Lee, it's a great question. And we do recognize, even though we always encourage that project staff are working with an evaluator to develop this evaluation plan up front, we certainly recognize that there are situations in which that's just not possible. So we really do hope that a lot of the resources that we have provided through the Evaluate website, particularly the evaluation plan checklist for ATE proposals, some of the templates that we have up there, from the data matrix template to the logic model template, can really help you create something that makes sense for you. The evaluation plan that's in the proposal is very general. Like I said, it's only two pages. I said general, but I don't mean general. I mean, it doesn't go into the full depth of the detail of exactly how the evaluation will be created, like a scope of work or an additional internal evaluation plan will be. So we do hope that you can work with some of these resources if you find yourself in a position where you really can't work with an evaluator. Something that Emma's going to mention in a minute or two, but I do want to point out now, is that Evaluate has started a free service for people who are submitting to ATE or already have ATE funding, is to work one-on-one with an evaluation coach. So Lee, if you find yourself in a position where you really can't work with an evaluator through a contract or a good faith contract beforehand, it might be a good idea to really talk with one of these evaluation coaches to see if they can help you talk through the process of what a good evaluation plan could look like for your proposal.
All right, so since we're on the topic of proposals, how fitting since we're talking about those. We've got some good questions submitted here by Jeremy. And we have kind of a two-parter here, so I'm going to explain it and then pop up the main question. He said, glad that there is a logic model mentioned. Is it included here in the supplementary materials? We actually got some responses in from the audience, and that's why I'm going to hold the question for just a moment to explain what else was said. David replied that a logic model should not be part of the supplementary documents if you want to ensure it be reviewed. As has been noted, reviewers are not required to read those supplementary docs. So kind of a question for you, Lissa, and we did get a response about kind of being able to squish down a logic model into a half page, but what is your thought about where a logic model should be included if you want to include one in your evaluation plan?
Yeah, I think a logic model can be really beneficial for both the project planning and explanation as well as the evaluation. So I would personally recommend that you try and fit it within that 15-page description. But I also wonder if Jeremy's question is referring to the logic model template resource from Evaluate. And we do have that linked to from the webinar page, which we will share a link with that has the slides and everything. You'll also receive that via an email after the webinar.
Excellent. So here is a question from Beth. In terms of the survey after graduation, so you were talking about that in this last section, what is the time frame of the grant? What if the time frame of the grant does not go that long? So included when unfunded. So she's talking about measuring those long-term outcomes, I believe. So what happens when the evaluation or the project doesn't go that long to actually see those?
Yes, Beth, this is something that we struggle with a lot, right? So ATE grants generally tend to be around 3 years, right? So how are we really getting to those long-term outcomes? How are we really measuring employment or other long-term outcomes with students? You know, I think there's a couple different ways that that can be done. You can certainly use previous research that has been done in order to make a theoretical connection between the short-term outcomes that you measure with the long-term outcomes that you're hoping for. It's also something that you can consider putting in actually a separate ATE targeted research project in order to say, you know, we have this type of project, this type of intervention going along, and we want to follow up with students, with alumni, to see how they're doing. So, you know, it really is hard sometimes. And that's why I said, you know, this is why people measure the easy things, right? It's much easier to ask about satisfaction and their experience right after a course rather than ask where they are going to be in 10 years, not even 5 years, particularly because the funding doesn't always go that far. So it certainly includes some creative thinking there. We did have a webinar last December, I believe it was, that through Evaluate that focused on impact evaluations and some creative ways to do that within the ATE context.
Next question up is from Chris. How important is it to include a logic model separate from a detailed evaluation chart? Are proposals with logic models in addition to an evaluation plan viewed more favorably?
Chris, I'm rereading your question to make sure that I'm answering, because you say, are proposals with logic models in addition to evaluation plans viewed more favorably? I want to just point out that certainly evaluation plans are very important. So no matter what, I would make sure you have an evaluation plan in your proposal. But in the logic model, you know, I really think the inclusion of it is around the idea of being clear and succinct and being able to communicate the intention of the project, what they hope to do, and how they hope to do it. And a logic model can be a great way to do that. And it can also be a good way to frame the evaluation, to make sure that questions are connected to both the processes and the activities of the project, as well as those outcomes. So I do think, I don't want to say that you have to have a logic model, that you have to do it in this way, right? I think you can do a really high quality proposal without one. However, I do think that including things like logic models and evaluation data matrices help the reviewer, help the proposal reader really make those connections, make sure that it's clear, make sure that they're not missing things in a paragraph narrative form, right? So giving them something to really quickly refer to and grab onto when they are reading a number of different proposals.
Thank you, Lissa. One more question came in from Chuck. Let's see, logic model versus theory of change. Lissa, can you give us a quick breakdown of the differences there?
Oh, Chuck, what a great question. You know, so many times in evaluation, we struggle with the fact that evaluators and people who work with evaluation and conduct evaluation come from different places, right? So we have a lot of different vocabulary that doesn't always mean the same thing to people, right? So what you say logic model or theory of change might differ from when someone else says logic model or theory of change. So I want to make sure I'm being clear in defining those two in my response. So generally, a logic model we refer to as something that is very concrete and measurable and specific. So we have the activities, the inputs, the activities, outputs, short-term and long-term outcomes. And so normally these are, or I don't want to say normally, but most of the time, because they are so measurable and specific that they can really attach to an evaluation plan very clearly. You can make evaluation questions out of them and identify measurable evaluation criteria and indicators. Whereas the theory of change tends to be bigger, tends to be more connected by theoretical assumptions and other research aspects that you bring in. So I think your question of which one should you do in a proposal goes back to my prior comment about there being no black and white, right or wrong way to do it. But realizing that both the logic model and the theory of change is a tool in order to clearly express the intentions of the activity, the proposed project, as well as the evaluation activities. And so whichever one you feel does that in a more easily accessible, concrete way is the one you should include. That's a good non-answer for you.
Well, thank you, Lissa. That actually was our final question that was submitted. So that was it. If we had any additional questions, you can always ask us later on by following up with us in a few different ways that we'll show you in just a few minutes. So with that, I'll go ahead and conclude our question and answer break, and we'll move on here. So the slides from this webinar are posted on Evaluate's website, along with several other resources. We have posted the link in the chat box, which Anna will do in just a moment for us. And you will also be navigated to this page once you close the webinar browser. We will email you the recording as soon as it is available. With that, it officially ends today's webinar. We will be sending out the recording in a few days, so make sure to check out our additional web detail resources on the website and the recording once it's available. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us. We really appreciate you being with us today. And as Lissa said, happy proposal writing.